Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live session today. My name is Rai. I'm here from FaceUp, and I have two great guest speakers to talk about what we're calling overcoming fear, speak up culture in action. As I mentioned, my name is Rai. I'm the content manager at FaceUp, and I'm also one of our senior copywriters. I have the pleasure of hosting Tyler Schultz and Andrew Samuels today, our guest speakers. Tyler, if you don't mind, could you jump in and just give us a brief introduction, a little bit of background, just to get us kicked off?
Absolutely, yeah. So, brief introduction to myself. My first job out of college was at Theranos, which is what I'm most well known for, is blowing the whistle there. But afterwards, I actually joined a lab at Stanford in their Center for Magnetic Nanotechnology and spun out a startup with one of my professors there. Unfortunately, that startup didn't quite make it through the COVID pandemic, but I immediately jumped in and started another company, also in diagnostics. I left that company a little over a year ago when my son was born. I just felt like, well, what I told my wife was once I graduated from college, I just been moving from stressful situation to the next stressful situation. And I just wanted a moment to step back and breathe and enjoy my life and my family. And also around that same time, Elizabeth and Sunny finally went to prison. And so I felt like this is a good time for me to be a little bit reflective on this experience that I had in my 20s and try to see if we can use it for positive change, turn the most negative experience of my life into a positive one. So that's what I'm focusing on now, is that and being a dad.
And that's great. We're super happy to have you here because, as you said, I think there's plenty to share on that topic, and it's something that we're very interested in. Andrew, if you don't mind, could you jump in and give us a quick background and intro to yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Andrew Samuels. So I'm the CEO of a company called Whistleport Compliance, and we specialize in GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. But my background for the last 15 odd years has been working in financial crime, global programs that have been fighting areas like corruption, money laundering. And for the last 10 years, that's focused in on whistleblowing in particular. So people may also be familiar with the Barclays CEO story, Jess Staley, the former CEO, who got caught trying to unmask a whistleblower on two occasions. We caught him twice. The board had to self-report him to the Financial Conduct Authority here in the UK. That was me. That was a program that I set up there. And on the back of that, I set up my first whistleblowing management company, which has now expanded, as we'll talk about today, because whistleblowing is such a component of good governance, risk, and compliance management as well. For the past 7 or 8 years now, I've also been developing the global standards around whistleblowing, internal investigations, governance and compliance for the International Standards Organization. And we've been building technologies and frameworks to support that. And just in line with Tyler's positive message as well. So a lot of people see GRC as a block or something that has to be done, but we actually see it as an enabler. We see it as something that gives you competitive advantage. And we're absolutely positive and passionate about the fact that organizations that do this well will be successful in the long term as well.
So just to give you a quick overview of the, let's say, like agenda or kind of general topics that we'll cover, we're definitely going to be looking into a little bit more about speak up culture and how that affects employees. As Andrew mentioned, we'll also get into more governance and compliance standards, some ISO standards, which he'll give us the details on and how we can kind of more easily understand them and also potentially implement them in the organizations that we have. And lastly, we'll kind of wrap it all up by doing a little Q&A session that will help us kind of connect some of these ideas about leveraging whistleblowing, understanding compliance, protecting employees, and ideally creating a better, more transparent world for all of us. So that being said, if you don't mind, I'll jump in. I'll give a little bit of background about Theranos just to kind of set the tone here. Theranos was once valued at $9 billion, and it was promised to revolutionize healthcare with a device that could perform hundreds of tests with a single drop of blood. It was backed by at least $1 billion in fundraising. They had a star-studded board, but behind the scenes, as we found out, their technology wasn't exactly as it seemed. Their tests were unreliable and often using machines that weren't exactly theirs. So Tyler, I think, will give us a little bit more insight on how they tried to cut corners and get around some of those things. As Tyler mentioned, he was one of the first whistleblowers to actually bring this up, as he was a young researcher working for them at the time. The SEC charged Theranos and their founder, Elizabeth Holmes, and her ex-partner and number 2 at the company, Ramesh Sunny Balwindi, I think it is. They got charged with fraud. This caused the company to collapse. Holmes was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Sonny was also convicted in a separate trial to 13 to 14 years in federal prison as well. And I think by now many of you have already heard about Theranos' downfall, but it's still a stark reminder of what the cost is in terms of ignoring ethics and transparency. Tyler, if you don't mind, we'll go a little bit deeper into the, let's say, employee perspective. So if you could share a little bit more about your personal experience with working at Theranos and how the culture affected employees like yourself.
Thank you so much for that intro. And it's funny, you gave like a 2 to 3 minute introduction to what Theranos is. And I just want to kind of point out that for me, I met Elizabeth when I was 20 years old, and she went to prison when I was 33. So that is like the time scale of my life, of how much of my life that this story consumed. But yeah, to your question, the only thing about Theranos that wasn't a secret was that they had this extreme culture of secrecy. And Elizabeth was very upfront about that. She said they had to be secretive because there were Chinese spies in Silicon Valley who were trying to steal their technology. She said that Quest and LabCorp were trying to figure out, what they were doing so they could try to catch up, because Theranos was, years and years ahead of Quest and LabCorp. And to me, as my first job out of college, I kind of bought those as, excuses for being in stealth mode. And they had been in stealth mode for 11 years when I first joined the company. And to illustrate how secretive they were, on my first day, they gave me a list of words that I was not allowed to say when describing my job to people outside the company. And those were words like biology, pipette, research. So it was like, you could not say anything. In fact, they gave you like this like canned statement. It's like, if someone asks you what you do for a living, tell them this. And it was like, I am revolutionizing healthcare. It's like, that is what I am supposed to tell people my job is. You weren't supposed to tell your spouses what you were doing at work. You were not supposed to put on LinkedIn that you worked at the company, because they said that other companies could look to see who they were hiring and kind of figure out, the types of things they were doing. And then even within the company, so those were all things you weren't supposed to share externally what the company was doing, but internally there were locked doors, there were barricades. You were told not to talk to colleagues about work. They were so incredibly secretive. And then after that, and actually on the secretive part, they were also secretive with regulators. So like when regulators came to inspect our labs, we locked the door to the lab that had all the Theranos devices. And the regulators were only shown third-party equipment. And so to me, it seemed like we had gotten our laboratory certificate under false pretenses. But then, so that's the first thing you'll notice about Theranos when you come in. The second thing you'll notice relatively quickly is that it was an absolutely, completely fear-driven culture. People were terrified. On my very first day, one of the managers of the validation lab was in the parking lot crying. And someone came over to the group of people I was with and said that she had had a screaming match with Sonny and Elizabeth, and she was immediately fired because they had some kind of disagreement. And you saw this pattern over and over and over, where if people disagreed with management, they were immediately fired. And in some cases, after they were fired, they were sued. And when they were sued, Theranos sent out a company-wide email about it. And if you read between the lines, the message was, "We will sue you too if you get in our way." And they had a board of directors who had, his former secretaries of state, secretaries of defense. People, even at the time, said that this board was more equipped to go to war than they were to, be a board of a diagnostics company. They had, like you mentioned, they had raised $1 billion in funding. They were incredibly powerful, incredibly scary. And they just took every possible opportunity to reinforce that culture of fear. Like, people had Post-it notes over their webcams because they thought Sonny was watching them while they were at their laptops. It was just, and then one more anecdote to highlight how fearful people were. Like, not only were people afraid to speak up, but people became afraid to quit. So I had one very close coworker who actually bought a house in another state and came into work on Friday, put in a full day's work, left his badge on the desk, and by Monday morning, he was literally living in another state, never gave notice, never wanted to formally quit because he was too afraid to have that type of conversation.
When you first start out in the workforce in particular, you're never quite sure what a good culture is. So you do go along with things. And I think people who hold to their values, and this will come into ethics and stuff later on as well, will sooner or later realize that something is wrong, because at first you will question yourself. You'll think, well, this is the way things are. To Tyler's point, there were some very senior people sitting on the board of Theranos, right? These are people who were well respected. probably more on the battlefield than maybe science, perhaps. But the point is, these are people that you're taught that you should trust, who've been successful career-wise, who've raised a lot of money. So they must get it. It must be me that doesn't get it. And you'll see that in organizations. And I think that's, you'll see that in lower level organizations. It doesn't always necessarily mean that it's quite as bad as it was at Theranos, but it's certainly an indication that something's wrong.
Can you kind of pinpoint both in terms of what Tyler just highlighted, but maybe also in terms of your general awareness of the situation? What are some things that Theranos really lacked in terms of, let's say, like governance and like proper compliance frameworks?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've identified there's three failures. So there's a failure of leadership. So there's a failure up at the board level of, former secretaries of state and other senior people to really provide the level of oversight that they should in any kind of, large organization risk-based model. There's also a failure of the regulators. Okay, so regulators need to take some responsibility in this as well. And I've worked on certain deferred prosecution agreements on HSBC, and I've seen that there's always an ongoing battle between regulators and businesses when it comes to this. However, regulators need to step up as well, and they need to be a little bit more forceful when there is a suspicion that something could be wrong. And then the final one is a failure of the investors when they did their due diligence as well. And I'll talk very briefly before I let you move on. There's just a few certain things that you can look at from a whistleblowing perspective that will raise the red flags, and it doesn't take a lot of time or money to do, right? But if you're coming into an organization to invest, let's look at Safeway, who invested $350 million in setting up stalls, for example. Ask the questions. How many people have raised a concern in this last year? Okay. And if the number is below the benchmark of about 1.5 per 100, red flag. What's the substantiation rate? If it's not between 30 and 40%, red flag. Okay. And the final one is, how many non-disclosure agreements have been signed off upon an employee leaving, not joining an organization when you're already asked to make sure that you're not sharing company information? That's standard practice. But NDAs being used for employees leaving is an indication that you're trying to buy their silence. And that should be the biggest red flag. And if you look at those three metrics alone, that should have given the investors a red flag. So
I'd love to get your thoughts on something real quick. So at Theranos, she would have said that it's standard practice that every single person signs an NDA, both when they enter and when they leave. So she would make the argument, this is not a red flag. We're not buying people's silence. It's our company policy that every single employee will sign a new NDA when they leave the company.
Yeah. Any compliance expert would tell you, no, that's not the case. An NDA, you sign the length of that at the very start. So, it can be in perpetuity if that's what you want it to be. But again, people can make those kind of arguments, but it doesn't make sense if you stop and think about that for 2 minutes. You've already signed an NDA. What's signing a new one going to do? And that's ultimately what it comes down to. And I mean, I'm happy to talk about this more offline, because it's a whole conversation piece in itself, as Tyler and I have had in the past as well. NDAs are commercial documents. They're signed to protect intellectual property, commercial secrets. They're not to silence people upon leaving about an organization, right? That's why you sign an NDA when you go into a business contract. That's why you sign confidentiality agreements when you enter an organization, not when you leave an organization.
I imagine myself both like starting a job or perhaps leaving a job, and there's a lot of like stress and unknowns and a whole lot of uncertainty, for that individual. So I'm thinking more of like the employee perspective. If someone puts a document in front of you, let's say on the way in, and you just really want to be a part of that company, you really need a job, you're probably going to sign. You're probably going to just, go ahead with it because maybe your livelihood depends on it.
There's a lesson for the wider stakeholder group. And by that, I really mean the investor group in this one, because, a 20-year-old Tyler being put in that position, I know it took longer than that, but you're not sophisticated. You don't have that level of knowledge, right? So you can't always expect somebody to understand maybe how wrong something is. But investors, people who are going to be putting $350 million of their own shareholder money into a scheme like this, right, should be doing their due diligence, and they should know to ask these questions. So, yeah, whilst it's sad, I think there's a little bit of culpability on the side of both the regulators and the investors that put such large sums of money into it. Failure of leadership at Theranos up at the board level, absolutely. There's some guilt on there. But the reality is, if you built a governance framework within there, I think Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny, they would have misused that, right? I mean, governance starts with intent. It starts with the tone from the top down and the intent to do the right things. And the intent wasn't there up at the sort of C level within that organization.
Yeah, and I think, kind of to make a little transition here, when you have those types of, let's say, like players in place, and they're all, putting big money up, they're, very excited, but they have their contemporaries with them, and they may feel off about something, but are they themselves willing to speak up or stand up and say, hey, guys, I'm interested, but what's this thing? Or do they go along with it and say like, hey, I'm here for the ride, and someone will sort it. Someone will take care of it. It must not be wrong.
It was mostly in Theranos. It was mostly the latter, and I would highlight that Elizabeth preyed on individual decision makers that she was able to manipulate at a personal level. One of the most astounding things that came out in the SEC investigation was that when she raised her mega round of hundreds of millions of dollars, not a single investor ever saw a financial statement. And they asked for financial statements and she refused to produce them. But they were willing to look past that because of everyone else who was willing to look past it. They pointed at George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Rupert Murdoch, Larry Ellison. They were not lacking for big names of people who had been incredibly successful in the past. And everyone felt like someone else has to understand what's happening here. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from this is that individual decision makers make terrible decisions. And the VCs of Silicon Valley, like I've spoken to, Vinod Khosla at Khosla Ventures and partners at Sequoia and Google Ventures. And they said they were pitched and they went and they visited Theranos and they had a team come in to run diligence and they had a process. That process said, do not invest. And then they didn't. And in a lot of ways, I feel like Silicon Valley VC doesn't get enough credit for staying out of this huge FOMO hype cycle, which is almost shocking that they didn't just, throw themselves into it.
Just to transition just a bit here, I wanted to kind of touch base on speak up culture and how, how intentionality actually is, maybe one of the foundational steps.
I think the best place to start. So one, I think it takes both culture and tools. I think that is like a really important thing to highlight here. And I think at any company, you can start by defining core values. And it's almost surprising to me that a lot of companies don't even have defined core values that they consistently communicate to their employees. And it's really interesting because the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, they collect all kinds of data. And they've been able to demonstrate that simply going through the exercise of defining core values reduces the average fines by like 60%. Like, it's like a very simple exercise, but once you've done it and you're communicating those core values, you've set goalposts that employees can hold their managers and executives to, and vice versa. The executives have a goalpost to hold their employees accountable to. And at Theranos, we did not have defined core values. They did not have values that were ever communicated to us. And I think that employees were constantly put in a situation where they were acting against their ethics, but they didn't have that core value to point back to. And a great example would be like if you walked into the lab right after an HIV quality control had failed, and Sunny, these executives and Sunny were telling the employees, run HIV samples anyway. And that lab tech is about to put the sample in to run a patient for HIV. If you were to ask them, is this the right thing to do? Given that the quality control failed minutes earlier, they would have said, no, I know this is not the right thing to do. And they would proceed to do it anyway. And that's because there was no emphasis on values. Whereas if they said, this is against our core value of, something along the lines of providing high quality medical care, they would have said, this is against a core value. And they would have been able to start that discussion. And so I think that that's one thing that is relatively easy to do, is go through that exercise. And then if you keep at it and consistently communicate those core values, it goes a long way in building your culture. And then again, I think it does take tools as well. Like you can build the best culture in the world, but if you don't give employees tools to act on these things, then it's almost, for nothing. Not completely, but it's almost for nothing. And on the flip side, one thing Theranos could have done, I could have seen them do this. They could have implemented a tool, either with like Whistleport or FaceUp, and it would have been purely a signal virtuing or a virtue signaling exercise. And the employees would not have used it because we would assume, if we pick up the whistleblower hotline, that the floor is going to fall out underneath us and we're going to like go the way of Sweeney Todd. It would have been like a way to catch snitches, really, as opposed to a way to address problems. So you really do need both of them.
Yeah, and I think those are really valid points and actually genuine concerns that a person who might feel like, hey, something isn't right here, something feels off, but at what cost do I mention it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to look at it from two perspectives very quickly here. So the first one's from the governance perspective. When we built out the global standards for governance, one of the core concepts is it's about purpose. What's the purpose of our organization? Because that needs to align to core values, needs to align to people's principles and what they do. So the purpose is about Whistleport. We make GRC simple, effective, compliant for our customers, right? That is our purpose. But to support that purpose, we also look at, okay, who are our stakeholders? How do we make sure that we're doing the right thing by the environment, by our society that we work for? How do we make sure that it's profitable? Because we are a business as well. It's not just about money, but it's about long-term success. And if you've got those values to anchor yourself back to, then your purpose will continue to be met. And I think that was one of the things that Tyler was pointing out there, right? That's your governance framework in 30 seconds. There's obviously a lot more to it, but I just want to get back to the very basics. Now, underpinning all of this, whether it's your governance, whether it's your compliance oversight, whether it's managing fraud, bribery, whatever it's going to be, whistleblowing is your most effective tool to prevent wrongdoing. And going back to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, because they come up with some of the best statistics from around the world, 43% of internal fraud is identified through internal speak-up channels, right? So there's already that ability to protect your own business internally from that perspective. But then when you look at the principles, again, one of the standards that I worked on is very close to my heart is ISO 37002, and that's the global standard for whistleblowing operations. And it's built on three principles. So it's trust, impartiality, and protection. Now, trust takes time to build, takes seconds to crumble, right? So it's got to be about aligning back to values, right? Sometimes it's about difficult conversations. Impartiality, it's about making sure that, everything is treated in an impartial and an objective way. And most organizations find that quite difficult to do because it's easy to receive somebody's report. But if we don't like the person that gave us to report, how do we filter out subconscious bias, right? And that's just one of the many examples that, we help with when we go through our triage, which I'll talk to a bit more later on. The final one is protection. So one of the things that builds trust is about protecting the person that's raised the concern. It's also about protecting people who are potentially exposed to the wrongdoing. It's also about protecting the person or persons that are subject of the concern because natural justice needs to play a part. And that takes away the snitch element that people like to joke about and talk about so much. But ultimately, when you're protecting them, you're protecting the business and you're protecting your purpose. So you've ultimately got that virtuous circle, feedback loop. You're listening to people. You're protecting not just your bottom line, but you are building a culture in which people feel safe to speak up. And I think that, those two standards alone, if you implemented those core values, you'll see quite a substantial, return on investment, but you'll also find it easier to meet your purpose and to adhere to your values as well.
We're talking a little bit about like whistleblowing being a tool to like understand things internally and be able to take action. I think, just general feedback or raising a concern, not even in the form of the extreme of, let's say, like there's a legal issue or a misconduct or a fraud, but just, early on saying like, hey, something feels a little bit unusual. How important are feedback loops for organizational health? And what role do you think executives, higher level management play in facilitating these feedback loops?
Absolutely. So again, when we look at best practice, when we look at global standards, the plan, do, check, act cycle is so important, right? Because if you look at whistleblowing, right, if you take the word whistleblowing out of it and you just call it management information, right, we've got information from our first line of support, and they're telling us something about our organization that we should do something about, because ultimately you're hearing about a potential vulnerability in your organization. It might not always be wrongdoing, right? It might just be something that could become a problem in the future, so we can deal with that now. So how do you take those lessons and how do you build those back into a continual cycle? And the way that we do that for our clients, the way that we try to help organizations is to make sure that there's a process of when you capture the data. So if you've got a case and you've used the face-up system to be able to manage that case, you've got gold, right? You've got data gold right there in your organization to learn from, to make your organization stronger, to make it more defensible. But if you use it well, you're also building the culture on that as well. So every time that somebody raises a concern, there's a learning lesson there, not just upon the topic itself, but it can also come back to your different controls from your compliance framework as well. So you're strengthening, simplifying, protecting your organization. And the simpler it is, the more effective your staff are going to be at focusing on their core values. That gives you that competitive advantage we're talking about.
And Tyler, how do you think about in terms of like, feedback loops, or, at the end of my question, I talked about like, what role do executives play? And I'm almost afraid to even ask, and I kind of already assume your answer at Theranos, but maybe just kind of weigh in a little bit about the importance of feedback and, any level of person from the bottom all the way up to senior management. What do you think about their role in these?
Well, the feedback loops are incredibly important for building your culture. And so to me, I think the important thing to add here is that you should really try to practice on the small stuff. Like use small transgressions as opportunities to reinforce those core values, integrate these positive feedback loops where employees see if they raise a concern that they don't face any kind of retribution, that they're listened to, that they become accustomed to using the tools that are available, that they experience the culture that you've built. And you can do that with really small things. So I would say take the small things really seriously. And then along these same lines, there's an idea that Airbnb actually implements where they have these ethics advisors across the company, across different geographies, different departments, and they're all basically like on a Slack channel together. And if an employee has a question about, either their code of conduct or just like, this, maybe a client offered me a $200 gift card to Applebee's or whatever. And they generally don't know, like, can I accept this or not? And you want to make it so that people aren't afraid to ask those questions. You make it really easy to ask those questions and get answers quickly. And they could post that to the Slack, and then you'll have these ethics advisors. And you might think like over $200, this is a total waste of time, but it's absolutely not. If you have a team of people who go look at this question and say like, okay, this person has a question about whether they can accept $200. Like, let's take that really seriously. Let's create a policy. Let's communicate that policy. And give a really clear answer so that there's no ambiguity. That would be an example of showing that your culture is working and that you have the right tools in place.
And if I can just build on that a little bit as well, because ultimately what you want to see within there in terms of continual improvement, ongoing learning within an organization, you want to review your policy on an annual basis. You want to check the supporting controls and processes with it. You want to give your people training, right? So we look for annual training for people so they understand, gifts and hospitality is a great example there. $200 would buy you a lot of chicken wings at Applebee's, by the way. So, you have to ask some questions on that one right there. But the point is, if your people are well trained on that as well, if they've read their policy, if your policy is clear and if the training's been clear and people have given an hour of their time each year to be able to do that, then they're probably going to save 2 or 3 hours of company time by not needing to go back and ask those questions as well. So when I come back to competitive advantage, GRC is the right thing to do. I'm pretty sure that the people we've got on the call today are advocates for whistleblowing by the very nature of this kind of topic. But to sell it, to get it into organizations, to get people to buy into the continual improvement and doing it well, it's little things like that that can make a difference, right? 1 hour spent on training is 3 hours spent on the day job right there. And it's also lower, regulatory costs later on, legal costs if something's gone wrong, investigations cost if somebody's, actually gone out and eaten $200 worth of chicken wings. There's a lot of tidy benefits, and in big organizations, that can become quite a substantial sum as well.
And in some ways, I think maybe that was a bad example because likely a company like the size of Airbnb would already have a policy around accepting gifts. But I'm trying to think of an example where there might not be an existing clear policy where an employee should feel comfortable asking, like, is this okay? I genuinely don't know. And then you can have people kind of look at it, think about it, and come up with a collective answer, and then maybe create a new policy.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we like to help people with, because I mean, even from a startup, as organizations grow, you can grow into your governance, risk and compliance platform as well. When it's 5 people, you probably don't need that. But when it becomes 20 people, it doesn't take long to put a framework in place that says you can't accept, gifts over $20 or $50, for example, as well. And I think part of what we want to do in terms of making things simple, effective, compliant around whistleblowing as well in particular, is to actually take some of this stigma away that this has got to be complex, it's got to be difficult. Actually, the more straightforward you make it, the simpler it becomes for everybody to adhere to it as well. And again, I'm more than happy to talk to people offline about, how you can get that sort of that proportionality, because ISO standards are actually built to be scalable for organizations of any size or sector. So whether you're 20 people or whether you're 2,000 people, it can still adapt and it can apply and it can grow into that framework as well.
Absolutely. And again, we're already touching on some tools, and I think we've mentioned a little bit about how effective training can be. So just on that note about tools and training, I guess just if we can dive a little bit deeper in here. So I guess I just wanted to like pose the question, see if we can get a little bit more out of there, some real examples of tools or systems that might be most helpful for both the employees to feel safe, communicating and raising concerns, but also again for a company to feel like we're using things that are effective, that are helpful, and that makes sense, right? So Tyler, if you don't mind, maybe jump in and just talk a little bit more about some tools that either you find super useful or you've liked, or maybe you wish you had.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a lot of tools. I wish I had a FaceUp tool. I wish I had a WhistlePort tool. I wish that there were resources for me just for me to just better understand the situation I was in. I didn't even think of myself as a whistleblower until I saw it written in a newspaper, which tells you that I did not, get adequate protections for myself. I wish I was aware of government blowing channels where I would have been protected. But I would also want to point out to this audience that I think it's like 85% of the time a whistleblower goes to the SEC, they've tried to raise these concerns internally first, which means to you, at least 85% of the time, you have the opportunity to address this internally before a regulator gets involved. So I see that as a massive, massive opportunity. And then I also think putting the right leaders in place in the right positions. It's crazy to look back on this, but Theranos did not have a compliance officer. In a heavily, heavily regulated industry, we did not have a compliance officer. And I didn't even think about that at the time.
Another one of those red flags that like...
Yeah.
That is so bright red. I don't even have the words to the level of brightness of red for that one.
Yeah. So you need to have the right people in the right positions, put people in the right places at your company.
Yeah, Andrew, if you don't mind, if I would like to kind of put the spotlight back on you, because you and I've had, again, the pleasure of having a conversation with you when we're talking about how do you communicate this to, all levels of people, whether it's organization or potential employee. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about the tools, both that we offer, how we offer them together, and just what's out there to really help this situation be more accessible and easy to use for the people that, really need it, which is many of us.
Yeah, exactly. So I think if you look at a full whistleblowing program, it's not just about an incident happening itself, right? But it actually starts with the policy, the communications, the awareness, and the training which we can provide to people. So this is already signposting to your organization that we take this seriously. And it's not just about providing training for everybody and how to raise a concern. It's about providing training to managers and leaders so that they're aware of their obligations, their responsibilities if somebody raises a concern as well. And what that does is it means that they have to act in a certain kind of way because they can't say, I didn't know that. That defense has gone right there. And B, it also says to stakeholders, to shareholders, to people out there in society, we care. We're going to do the right things, right? So people are going to raise concerns, and absolutely shameless pitch for the FaceUp system at the moment too. I've worked with so many systems over the years, and there's more bells and whistles oftentimes that you can throw a stick at. And they don't work, okay? Things get lost. What people need to be able to do is to raise a concern simply and effectively and have two-way communications, right? You need to be able to protect their identity, whether they wish to remain anonymous or whether they wish to only be known to some people in the organization. So you need an ability to redact. And for many organizations, especially in Europe, but also North America, Spanish language and French in certain places, Portuguese in South America, you need the ability to be able to communicate with different languages, right? You've got to be able to store data in a defensible way with a date and a timestamp because it's going to be used as part of an investigation later on. You need to be able to defend your position. And FaceUp does that beautifully, right? Because it's simple. And when we talk about our ethos as simple, effective, compliant from a WhistlePort side, we have very deliberately chosen to partner with an organization that I think is new, exciting, has the right ethos, has the right technology. It gives people what they need rather than what they sometimes think that they want. Okay, so that's the first part. And the second part is when people actually have a concern come through to them. This is where things often go wrong because what do we do with this concern? Okay, and this is where we have a triage tool. And this triage tool is very much aligned to ISO 37002 to start off with. And it helps us do an assessment against the nature of the concern that's come through, helps us assess the risk to the person who's raised the concern, helps us do an assessment of the risk to the people who are involved in the concern, whether it's the subject of the concern whether it's witnesses, whether it's customers who might be about to buy an unsafe product, for example. And we also look at the evidence availability, okay, because oftentimes that helps to determine how you can proceed with that. This helps make what we call an objective and defensible position. And it actually takes a lot less time than trying to make it up on the spot every single time as well, right? If the regulators come in and ask, how did you do that? You can say it's in line with ISO 37002. We've set our own parameters based upon our risk management profile internally. So everything is objective. It doesn't matter who raised the concern. We're focused solely upon the evidence and the information available. And then the final part is, how do we investigate it? Should it require an investigation as well? So ISO 37008, the global standard for internal investigations, which again we worked on, we helped set a terms of reference for investigation, because what happens a lot of the time, people hit the panic button and say, let's go and get the lawyers involved in this, and everyone's happy until the bill comes in. And they realize that the investigation was spread too wide, it didn't achieve the intended outcomes, and it's cost a hell of a lot of money as well. But by putting a terms of reference in place, understanding the scope, understanding the priorities, talking about how we're going to manage this, helps you protect the whistleblower, helps you protect the integrity of the case as it's being managed as well, should it need to go to tribunal or some other sort of legal forum as well. And it means that you get a return on investment for that. So it works. That information provides that continual loop that we spoke to earlier on, because you can feed that back into the organization as it works. And when it works, it sends a signal to the good people in the organization that we can raise concerns. They do take us seriously. It also sends a signal to people who might be thinking about doing something wrong that I'm probably likely to get caught here. I'll go work for Theranos instead.
Yeah. Andrew, if you don't mind, I really like, all of the things that you just touched on there, but I try to be a little bit aware of, like, someone who might have heard all of this for the first time, someone that is new to the concepts of compliance and governance, or even like whistleblowers or whistleblowing tools. If I could be so bold to ask you, we talked about this in terms of a Formula One racing team, and you had this really, really nice anecdote about how a tool that both Facelift provides and that Whistleport provides, how that kind of all comes together. So if you could just, before we head over to our Q&A session, maybe if we end on a visual, a little bit of an anecdote here.
You'll see my smile of happiness if people like my analogies.
Oh, come on.
So thank you, Ry. You and I are friends. The way that I describe this, and it's genuine, is I look at the face-up system as a Formula One car. It's powerful. It can go very fast. It can do a lot of great things. But Whistleport, in partnership, we're the right tires and the right tire pressure, we're the navigation system, we're the safety mechanism, we're the training instructor for the drivers. Okay, we're the things that make that car safe and effective, so that you get the absolute best out of it as well. Because what you want from these tools is you want to make them work simply, effectively, and compliantly for your organization. So, on that Formula One, we understand when to go on the soft tires, when to use the mediums, when to use the hard rubbers on the road. Okay, we understand when you might want to have a halo, or if it's in training, maybe you don't need a halo. Not that I would recommend that for a Formula One driving, but we can talk to these things. But we also provide the driver training as well. Okay, so not just for people who are going to be driving the Formula One car, but also people who work directly in the whistleblowing team, but for the pit crew as well, for the board members who've got that responsibility for oversight, and for the managers who might have a concern raised to them by somebody who doesn't even realize that they're raising a concern, but we've taught them how to recognize that there's a puncture in that soft tire, and we're going to have to go and bring them back into the pit stop for another change. And I think that's what makes us such a powerful combination together, because you've got a super powerful tool and supported by best-in-class processes and the triage systems that we've got as well. It means that you really get that value out of your whistleblowing system. And to leave it on a single note, again, using ACFE data, an average fraud costs an organization $1.5 million US. So if you can prevent one fraud every 5 years, you're making a significant return on investment right there as an organization. And it's not just that you're doing the right thing, you're getting some economic and reputational benefits out of it as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. I just wanted to get that in there if we could, because I thought you put it so well when we had a chance to be on another call. Okay, so just being mindful of the time, I could spend a lot more time talking to each of you, going deeper detail on these topics, because they're very interesting to me, not only as a writer in the topic, an employee of a whistleblowing platform and software, but I just in general think about how we can make our workplaces and just essentially our world, a little bit better, a little bit more transparent, a little bit safer, and to have us feel a little bit more confident and comfortable to say, hey, if something feels off, I should be able to speak about it, and I feel comfortable speaking about it. So thank you for touching on those things. I have a couple of questions that were already prepared and already asked for Andrew and Tyler. So maybe I'll just kick off with one with Tyler. I can see one in the Q&A, then we'll jump into that. And if anyone else has any other questions, we'll spend the remainder of the time kind of focusing on taking your questions. So Tyler, if you don't mind, just one, this one kind of brings it back to the beginning a little bit. It was more about your personal experience, but one of the questions that came in earlier was, how did you deal with the personal challenge of whistleblowing? Not just about your job or your career or these types of things, but there had to have been some kind of, personal effects, whether that's with family or these types of things. So I guess the question focuses on, how do you deal with those personal challenges? And if there's any advice you could give to someone today, knowing what you know, what would that advice be?
Yeah, I mean, there were significant personal challenges, and it's just no one should have to go through what I did in order to raise the concerns that I did. Like, it took an enormous toll on my mental health, on my relationships with my parents and my grandparents. It took a huge financial toll. I ended up spending between $400,000 and $500,000 in legal fees defending myself, because I had a very specialized IP attorney, I had a criminal defense lawyer, I had a litigator, I had a defamation lawyer, I had whistleblowing attorneys. And so it was incredibly expensive. And at one point, I learned that if we went to court with Theranos, the best case scenario would be we would spend $2 million and win. And the worst case scenario was to spend more money than that and lose and go to prison. And my parents literally begged me not to pick either option. They said, we will sell our house to pay for your legal fees, but please do not make us do that. Give up. Sign whatever it is Theranos wants you to sign. And at the time, Theranos wanted me to sign these affidavits that basically retracted everything I had said to the Wall Street Journal, that said I was young, that I was dumb, that I was uneducated, that I was mad at Elizabeth, that I didn't know what I was doing, that I misunderstood. And ultimately, one of my core values is truth. And what I told my parents was that I cannot sign these documents under penalty of perjury that I do not believe are true. And what they want me to say is not true. So just having a firm set of core values just led me to continue fighting this fight. But there were certainly a lot of very, very challenging times.
Yeah, I almost can't even imagine. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, I can see a couple more questions in here. I have one that I'm going to read out of the Q&A. It's a little bit longer, so bear with me. So here, I'm just going to read it straight as is. It says, I'm the editor of a UK waste and recycling sector trade magazine. There is a big problem with waste crime and incidents of forced labor, which undermines legitimate businesses. How can a healthy whistleblowing culture be established across like a whole diverse sector? There are some big players, but many businesses in the value chain are small, and they don't necessarily have the time or resources to devote to such good practice. Andrew, I think if you don't mind, you can jump in on that, and then of course, Tyler, if you have some insights as well.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really tough one, because that brings into play logistics as well. And these are some of the toughest topics that you get out there. Waste management. One of the people I worked with on building the standards, actually, he was a member of Parliament for the Quebec Parliament in Canada, and he'd blown the whistle on corruption within the building sector, which is quite similar in terms of like forced labor, human rights violations within there as well. And some of the challenges, before I get into some of the solutions, are you've got potentially uneducated people, who are working under duress. So how do you build channels for people to be able to report against that? And again, it starts with the end user, bigger organizations, right? And this is where you start to tie your governance back together, and you look at your supply chain, right? Supply chain due diligence is a part of that. And actually, if you're going out to tender for organizations that are going to support you in a supply chain, one of the key things that people should look at is, do you have a whistleblowing policy? How many concerns have been raised? What's your substantiation rate? How many NDAs have been put in place, right? Because that gives you an indication that the organization downstream that you're dealing with has a speak up culture within there as well. And you can ask an additional question, which is, do you ensure that organizations that you interact with also have these whistleblowing policies in place and these whistleblowing capabilities in place. Because what you're trying to do is you can't control what is two organizations downstream, but you can put controls in place that minimize the risk that somebody in your procurement chain is going to have that as well. And then again, the second thing is seeing that they've got a tool such as a FaceUp tool, right? Because a lot of people don't have access to phone calls to be able to call up. People aren't going to send letters. And if they're working remotely on sites, they're not going to go and talk to their managers because they're probably the one perpetrating some of the violations that are taking place. But most people do have a mobile phone. They can get on and raise a concern. There is that ability to be able to do that in a private moment, in a private corner somewhere as well. And where you've got the different language capabilities that can be translated two ways, which I mentioned before. Let's say that somebody's brought in, some forced labor from a different country speaking a different language. They can raise that concern in their language. We can triage it in our own language, and we can communicate two ways through the translation services that are there. So it's about trying to extend your supply chain there and building controls that ensure that you're only operating with ethical organizations, and an ethical organization is only an ethical organization if they're only engaging with other ethical organizations downstream. You never get rid of it 100%, but if you put those controls in place, you do away with a good 90%, I would say, of a lot of forced labor, especially in Western countries where those supply chains are utilized.
Tyler, I would just like to ask you one more thing. Of course, Andrew, please, feel free to weigh in. And then if our audience could bear with us for just a few more minutes, I would love to give some space for a final thought from each of our speakers. So just before we move on to final thoughts, the question, I guess I want to direct it a little bit more to Tyler, based on your experience, is how has the perception of whistleblowing or whistleblowers changed over time? Do you think, it's more positive or more negative these days?
I think it is more positive, for sure. And when I made the decision to go public with my story and to go public as the whistleblower, one of the concerns was that I would never be able to work again, at least not in the same industry. And because that is the typical path for whistleblowers. But I found the complete opposite response. When I went on the record, I had tons of inbound from either emails, text messages, phone calls, LinkedIn's that basically said, if you're looking to get back on your feet, come work with us. And I got these messages from academic institutions, from big biotech companies, from venture capital firms. And so it was actually the complete opposite response that I was expecting. I'm still not 100% sure why that was. I think it might be partly because I was so young when I blew the whistle. I also think it's industry specific. So I think possibly in life sciences, people tend to be more data driven. And so there's maybe more respect for what I did than something like a government whistleblower or a financial service. And then I think the other part is that overall, I think the stigma around whistleblowers is easing a bit.
Yeah. Can I just add to that as well? I think, well, you didn't do yourself full justice there, Tyler, so I'm going to do you full justice on this one as well. There are a lot of people out there who recognize that people who have the moral courage to stand up and do the right thing and speak up for the truth are people worth having in your organization. I mean, Tyler's story is very public because of the people that were associated and involved in that, right? I mean, you can't underestimate, I will never be able to have walked in your shoes or imagine the pressure. I've worked with a lot of whistleblowers in the past and supported whistleblowers, but none who've been under the kind of duress that you were put under for that, right? And anybody who wouldn't want to hire a whistleblower is stupid. Okay, that's very undiplomatic of me to put it that way. But whistleblowers are brave, right? People who speak up, especially because people have to speak out as well, have generally tried to speak up within an organization to do the right thing. And a lot of people will sign an NDA in the end, right? Because, you heard Tyler's economic damage and how much pressure that put him and his family under, right? You can't blame a person potentially for walking away from that. It takes a special sort of courage to actually fight back and to put yourself on the line for something like that. And any organization that wants to get somebody that's going to stand up for the truth and bring integrity to that organization, hire a Tyler, hire a whistleblower, because they're the best kind of people out there.
So on that, I would just like to give maybe a minute or two for each of you, just a final thought, make it quick, make it short. Kind of the microphone is yours. So Andrew, if you don't mind, maybe kick us off and then we'll wrap up with Tyler.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when you look at GRC in an organization, right, whistleblowing, let's not even call it whistleblowing, right? Just the ability for people to raise a concern within an organization is such a fundamental cornerstone of building a successful organization, right? One of my lessons learned over, working whistleblowing for over 10 years directly now is that you can sit down and you can have a nice conversation about the ethics of it and everybody will agree with you. But actually, let's also talk about the benefits, the economic benefits, the reputational benefits, because that's the call to action as well, right? Let's not just look at the whistleblowers. Let's look at how do you get investors involved in this to look and ask the right questions? How do you make sure the regulators are doing a good job? Because in doing that, you're helping organizations serve their purpose, adhere to their values, and that serves society in the way that we want them to be served. So whistleblowing is a force for good.
Thank you very much. And Tyler, let's close it out here with you.
And the final point I want to wrap with is that these topics are not just about preventing massive fraud. I think it's really easy for people to say like, well, I just won't commit billions of dollars worth of fraud. And you probably can, just make that decision to not do it. But this is not just about not committing massive fraud. It is about your ability as an organization or as a leader to see around corners, to hear what your employees might not want to tell you, and to be able to address issues before they grow into massive problems. And if you're able to do that, then you're building a culture of principled and a culture of being able to make principled and courageous decisions. And that is not just a competitive advantage. That is an absolute superpower.
I can't put it any better myself. Both of you, one more time, thank you very, very much for the insight and sharing not only those pieces of gold, but real practical things that we can kind of think about. And we have the power to act. We can take advantage of these tools. We can take advantage of this advice, and collectively and together, I think we can make a positive impact in this world, in these workplaces. So on that note, thank you from all of us at FaceUp, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you,
Thanks for
everyone.
having us.